The Palace of Versailles stank of shit, literally. And nobody tells you this in the history books. Today, you're going to discover the disgusting secret that French royalty hid behind all that opulence. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and stick around until the end if you want to uncover the dark truths of royalty. When you think of Versailles, what comes to mind? Gold, crystal, massive mirrors, enormous halls full of elegant people dancing waltzes, right? The perfect image of European high society, the ultimate symbol of luxury and power. But I'm going to tell you now what really happened in those gleaming corridors. And believe me, you'll never see that place the same way again. Brace yourself, because this story is heavy. And absolutely stinking. Let's start from the beginning. Versailles was built by Louis XIV, the Sun King, in the 17th century. He wanted to create the most impressive palace in the world, and he succeeded. Spent an obscene fortune, brought in the best architects, the best artists, the best decorators from all across Europe, created gardens that looked like something out of a fairy tale, built the Hall of Mirrors, that legendary corridor with 357 mirrors. It was enough to leave anyone speechless. But there's one detail the Sun King forgot. Rather an important detail. Toilets. That's right. He built a palace with over 2,300 rooms, but forgot to make enough toilets for everyone who was going to live and work there. Have you ever stopped to think how many people lived at Versailles? It wasn't just the king and the royal family. There were thousands of people. Nobles, servants, guards, cooks, maids, courtiers. Everyone wanting to be close to power. Everyone living in the same place. And all of them needed to wee and poo. Seems obvious, doesn't it? But apparently it wasn't quite so obvious to the Sun King. So what did these people do? Well, the lucky ones, like the royal family and some very important nobles, had access to perforated chairs. You know, those old chairs that had a hole in the middle and a bucket underneath. That's it, posh, innit? But even then, someone had to empty that bucket afterwards. And throw the contents where. Good question. Now, imagine everyone who didn't have access to even that. The vast majority of people at Versailles had nowhere to relieve themselves with dignity. So they improvised. And when I say improvised, I mean they literally went in any corner they could find. The corridors of Versailles became public lavatories. People hid behind curtains, behind statues, in dark corners, and went right there. There were people doing it on the staircases, on the balconies, in the gardens as well, but at least there you had space and fresh air. Inside the palace was worse. Much worse. During the grand balls and parties, when the palace was packed with people, the situation was catastrophic. Imagine hundreds of people dancing, eating, drinking wine, and suddenly someone needs the toilet. But there's no toilet available. Or there's a massive queue. What does the person do? They discreetly slip away, find a less busy corridor, lift the layers and layers of dress, or pull down their breeches, and go right there, behind an incredibly expensive velvet curtain, or in the corner of a hall decorated with paintings worth fortunes. And it wasn't just the nobility either. The servants did it too. Everyone did it, because there was no alternative. It was that or burst. Now comes the most disgusting part. Nobody cleaned properly. There were people responsible for cleaning, of course, but they couldn't keep up. There was too much of it. The smell of urine and feces became embedded in the walls, the carpets, the curtains. Versailles stank. The most luxurious palace in the world reeked of sewage. The French perfumes we know today, those famous, expensive, sophisticated perfumes, they were developed precisely during this period. Know why? To disguise the stench. The French nobility drowned themselves in perfume. They drenched their clothes, their handkerchiefs, their hair, all to try to hide the smell of shit that was everywhere. Women used fans not just to look elegant, they used them to waft away the smell, to create a current of air that would carry that stench away from their noses, at least for a few seconds. Men put flowers in their lapels, carried little bags with aromatic herbs, anything to avoid smelling the true scent of Versailles. And there's more, the diseases, because obviously a place like this becomes a breeding ground for bacteria and illness. Dysentery was extremely common. Cholera, typhoid, people were constantly falling ill, and many died. But nobody wanted to leave Versailles, because being close to the king meant power. It meant influence. It meant money. So they endured it. Lived in all that filth because the price of being far from the center of power was too high. Even Louis XIV himself suffered from chronic intestinal problems. He had fistulas, hemorrhoids, constipation. Part of that was due to the rich diet of the period, but part was also due to the unsanitary conditions in which he lived. Even being the king, even having the best doctors in France, he couldn't escape the consequences of living in a place without proper sanitation. And look at the irony. Louis XIV was obsessed with personal cleanliness. He bathed regularly, which was rare at the time, changed his clothes several times a day, used the finest perfumes. But what good was all that if he lived in a palace that smelled like a latrine? The situation was so absurd that there are accounts of nobles who avoided certain corridors at specific times because they knew it would be full of people relieving themselves there. There was like an unofficial collective knowledge about which areas to avoid and when. Imagine having to plan your route inside your own home to avoid stepping in poo. And the gardens of Versailles, those beautiful gardens that appear in all the photos. They also served as public toilets. People went there, hid behind the perfectly pruned trees and bushes, and went there. The gardeners at Versailles didn't just tend to the plants. They spent a good part of their time cleaning human feces off the lawn. There's a famous story about Madame de Maintenon, who was Louis XIV's second wife. She constantly complained about the smell, said she couldn't sleep properly because of the stench that came through the windows. And mind you, she had one of the best bedrooms in the palace. If she was complaining, imagine what it was like for everyone else. Another interesting thing is that this situation wasn't exclusive to Versailles. Other European palaces had similar problems. The Louvre Palace in Paris, before it became a museum, was also known for stinking. Hampton Court Palace in England had the same problems. It was widespread at the time. The difference is that Versailles was the biggest, the most famous, the most luxurious. So the contrast between the beauty and the filth was even more shocking. Foreign visitors who went to see Versailles for the first time were always impressed. First by the beauty, by the gold, by the mirrors, by the gardens, and then by the smell. There are letters from ambassadors and diplomats describing this shock. They wrote about how surreal it was to see so much ostentation mixed with so much filth. And the worst part is that everyone pretended everything was fine. It was part of court etiquette not to mention these things. It was considered bad manners to complain about the smell or talk about bodily functions. So everyone acted as if nothing was happening. They smiled, danced, chatted about art and politics, whilst holding their breath. Children who grew up at Versailles thought it was normal. They didn't know any other reality. To them, living in a palace where people did poos in the corridors was just part of life. Imagine growing up like that and thinking it's normal. Only at the end of the 18th century did they start making some improvements. They built more toilets, created a slightly better system for dealing with waste. But it still wasn't enough. And soon after came the French Revolution, and the royal family had to flee Versailles. The palace was basically abandoned for a time. When Versailles was restored and opened as a museum, many years later, they obviously installed modern toilets. But those walls have seen a lot. Those beautiful corridors that tourists walk through today were once used as latrines by hundreds of desperate people. The truth is that we look at history and romanticize everything. We see the pretty dresses, the elaborate wigs, the ballrooms lit by candles. But we forget that these people were human. They ate, drank, and yes, did poos and wheeze like anyone else. And when you put thousands of people in a place without adequate infrastructure, it doesn't matter how much gold you put on the walls. It's going to stink. Versailles is perfect proof that you can have all the money in the world, all the ostentation, all the luxury, but if you don't have the basics, if you don't have sanitary dignity, none of it is worth anything. The French nobles lived surrounded by art, by music, by refined food. But at the end of the day, they had to hold their noses to walk through their own corridors at home. So next time you see a photo of Versailles, or a film about French royalty, remember this story. Remember that behind all that beauty there was a horrible smell. That people danced in halls where someone had done a wee in the corner an hour before. That the perfectly symmetrical gardens were full of poo hidden behind the bushes. History isn't just what they show you in books. Real history has a smell. And in this case, it's not a pleasant one. Versailles was and remains one of the most impressive places in the world. But now you know the truth. The dirty, stinking, and very human truth behind all that gilded ostentation. If you enjoyed discovering this disgusting side of history, subscribe to the channel because there's loads more bizarre history coming your way.